Welcome back to Crimson Cases, the channel where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. Every week, we bring you stories that are not just tales of crime, but are chilling reminders of the fragility of life and the shadows that lurk just beneath the surface of the everyday. The story we are about to unfold is one that sent shockwaves through a quiet community. A story of two young women whose bright futures were extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. The terrifying truth of what happened to them would leave everyone in a state of cold fear, a fear that still lingers to this day. We pour our hearts into researching and bringing you these important stories, and it would mean the world to us if you would take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss an episode and you'll be supporting us in our mission to give a voice to the voiceless. Now, settle in and prepare yourselves for a journey into the heart of darkness. This is the story of the case that came to be known as the Silent Creek Murders. The morning of October 14, 2023, broke over the small, sleepy town of Havenwood with a deceptive calm. The air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. For the residents of this idyllic community, nestled deep in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, it was a day like any other. Children were being bundled off to school, their laughter echoing in the quiet streets, while their parents embarked on the familiar rhythm of their daily routines. No one in Havenwood could have possibly imagined the horror that was about to unravel, a horror that would forever shatter their sense of security and leave an indelible stain on the town's pristine image. The first discordant note in this symphony of tranquility was struck by a man named George Hemlock, a retired logger in his late 60s who had a penchant for early morning walks with his golden retriever, Rusty. Their usual route took them along the winding path of Silent Creek, a picturesque stream that meandered through a dense forest on the outskirts of town. It was a place of serene beauty, a place where the only sounds were the gurgling of the water, the rustling of leaves, and the cheerful chirping of birds. But on this particular morning, the silence of Silent Creek was different. It was heavy, oppressive, and tinged with an unspoken dread. As George and Rusty rounded a bend in the path, the dog suddenly stopped, his ears perked up and a low growl rumbling in his chest. George, accustomed to his dog's usually placid nature, was immediately on alert. He followed Rusty's gaze and saw something that made his blood run cold. Lying partially submerged in the shallow, crystal-clear water of the creek were two figures. At first, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. He thought perhaps they were mannequins, discarded and forgotten. But as he took a hesitant step closer, the horrifying reality of the situation crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. These were not mannequins. They were the bodies of two young women. The scene that confronted George was one of unimaginable brutality. The women, who appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, were positioned in a macabre tableau. They were back to back, their bodies bound together with thick, coarse rope. Their clothes were torn and disheveled, and their faces, even in the dappled morning light, were contorted in masks of terror. The clear water of the creek was stained with a crimson cloud that swirled around them like a shroud. George, a man who had spent his life in the rugged wilderness and had seen his fair share of nature's harsh realities, had never witnessed anything so profoundly disturbing. For a moment, he was paralyzed by a mixture of shock, fear, and a deep, gut-wrenching sadness. Then his instincts kicked in. He fumbled for his phone, his trembling fingers barely able to dial the emergency number. His voice, when he finally managed to speak, was a hoarse, strangled whisper. I found something terrible, in Silent Creek. The arrival of the Havenwood Police Department shattered the morning's deceptive calm. The first on the scene was Sheriff Brody, a man who had served the community for over 30 years. He was a pillar of strength and stability in a town where the most serious crimes were usually petty thefts and the occasional bar fight. The sight that greeted him at Silent Creek was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his long and distinguished career. The brutality of the scene was a stark and jarring contrast to the tranquil beauty of the surroundings. He immediately knew that this was not the work of some local troublemaker. This was the work of a monster. As more officers and forensic teams arrived, The area was cordoned off and a meticulous investigation began. Every leaf, every stone, every ripple in the water was treated as a potential piece of a puzzle that no one yet understood. The two victims were carefully removed from the creek, their bodies handled with the utmost care and respect. They were transported to the county morgue, where the grim task of identifying them and determining the cause of death would begin. Back at the crime scene, the investigators worked with a quiet, grim determination. They combed the area for any sign of a struggle, any foreign object, any clue, no matter how small, that could shed some light on what had happened. They found tire tracks on a nearby dirt road, a single, discarded cigarette butt, and a few strands of what appeared to be dark, synthetic fibers caught on a thorny bush. But there were no footprints, no murder weapon, and no obvious signs of who could have committed such a heinous act. The news of the discovery spread through Havenwood like a wildfire. The idyllic town, once a haven of peace and security, was now gripped by a collective sense of fear and disbelief. Doors were locked, children were kept indoors, and a palpable sense of unease hung in the air. The victims were soon identified as two local girls, Sarah Jenkins and Emily Peterson. Both were 19 years old, lifelong friends, and beloved members of the community. Sarah was a talented artist, known for her vibrant paintings and her infectious laugh. Emily was a dedicated student with dreams of becoming a veterinarian, her kind and gentle nature endearing her to everyone she met. The news of their deaths sent a fresh wave of shock and grief through the town. These were not just anonymous victims. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and neighbors. Their absence left a gaping hole in the fabric of the community. The autopsies revealed the full extent of the horror that had been inflicted upon Sarah and Emily. They had both been subjected to a brutal and sustained assault. The cause of death for both was determined to be a combination of blunt force trauma and strangulation. There was also evidence that they had been held captive for a period of time before their deaths. The details of the autopsy report were so gruesome that they were not released to the public, but the whispers and rumors that circulated through the town painted a chilling picture of their final hours. The killer, it seemed, was not just a murderer. He was a sadist who took pleasure in the suffering of his victims. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. Sheriff Brody and his team worked around the clock, chasing down every lead, no matter how tenuous. They interviewed family members, friends, and anyone who had seen Sarah and Emily in the days leading up to their disappearance. They learned that the two girls had been at a party on the night they went missing. It was a bonfire party in the woods, a popular gathering spot for the young people of Havenwood. They had left the party together at around midnight, telling their friends that they were going to get something to eat at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. They were never seen alive again. The investigation into the party yielded a long list of potential witnesses, but no one seemed to have seen anything out of the ordinary. The usual teenage drama and revelry had been the order of the day. There were a few minor scuffles, a few broken hearts, but nothing that could have possibly escalated into such a horrific act of violence. The diner they had planned to go to had no record of them ever arriving. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air between the bonfire and the diner. The tire tracks found near the crime scene were analyzed and found to belong to a late-model pickup truck, a common vehicle in a rural community like Havenwood. The cigarette butt was sent to the lab for DNA analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The synthetic fibers were also analyzed and found to be from a type of industrial-grade rope, the same type that had been used to bind the victims. This suggested that the killer was someone who had access to such materials, someone who was perhaps involved in a trade or a hobby that required the use of heavy-duty rope. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation seemed to be hitting a dead end. The initial flurry of leads had dried up, and the trail was growing cold. The pressure on Sheriff Brody and his team was immense. The media had descended on Havenwood, their sensationalist headlines and constant speculation adding to the town's fear and anxiety. The families of Sarah and Emily were desperate for answers, their grief compounded by the agony of not knowing who was responsible for their daughters' deaths. The town of Havenwood, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, was now a community living in the shadow of a killer, a faceless monster who had shattered their world and left them all in a state of cold fear. The silence of Silent Creek had been broken, and in its place was an echo of terror that resonated through the heart of the town. The investigation was far from over, and the terrifying truth of what had happened to Sarah Jenkins and Emily Peterson was still waiting to be unearthed. But one thing was certain. The killer was still out there, and he could be anyone. He could be a neighbor, a friend, a familiar face in the crowd. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. The initial shock that had paralyzed Havenwood began to slowly recede, replaced by a gnawing, persistent fear that settled over the town like a suffocating shroud. The vibrant colors of autumn, which had once been a source of joy and celebration, now seemed to mock the community with their cheerful display. The once familiar faces of neighbors were now viewed with a flicker of suspicion, a silent question hanging in the air. Could it be you? Sheriff Brody felt the weight of this collective fear pressing down on him, a constant, heavy presence that accompanied him through his sleepless nights and his long, frustrating days. The investigation into the murders of Sarah Jenkins and Emily Peterson had entered its third week, and they were no closer to finding the monster who had ripped the heart out of their town. The incident board in the small conference room of the Havenwood Police Department was a chaotic tapestry of photographs, notes, and timelines. The smiling faces of Sarah and Emily in their high school graduation photos were a stark and painful reminder of the lives that had been so brutally extinguished. Around their pictures, a web of connections, potential leads, and dead ends spread out like the cracks in a shattered mirror. Brody would spend hours staring at the board, his mind a whirlwind of theories and possibilities, each one more a dead end than the last. He and his team had re-interviewed everyone who had been at the bonfire party, their questions more pointed, more probing this time. They were looking for inconsistencies, for any small detail that someone might have overlooked or deliberately withheld. A few names began to surface as persons of interest. The first was a young man named Jake Miller, a known troublemaker with a history of petty crimes and a volatile temper. He had been at the party and had reportedly gotten into a heated argument with Sarah earlier in the evening. Witnesses said he had been drinking heavily and had made some aggressive and unwelcome advances towards her. When she had rebuffed him, he had become enraged, shouting obscenities and making veiled threats. Several people had seen him storm off into the woods shortly after the argument. When questioned, Jake denied everything. He claimed he had gone home after the argument and had passed out in his bed. His alibi was flimsy at best, and his aggressive and defensive demeanor during the interrogation did little to assuage Brody's suspicions. The second person of interest was a man in his late 30s named Mr. Henderson, a reclusive and eccentric individual who lived in a rundown cabin on the outskirts of town, not far from where the girls' bodies had been discovered. He was known to be a bit of a loner, a man who kept to himself and was rarely seen in town. Rumors and local legends had always swirled around him, with some of the more imaginative townsfolk whispering that he was a practitioner of dark arts, a man who communed with spirits in the dead of night. While Brody dismissed these as nothing more than small-town gossip, he couldn't ignore the fact that Henderson's cabin was in close proximity to the crime scene. A search of his property yielded nothing out of the ordinary, but his strange and evasive answers during questioning raised more questions than they answered. He claimed to have been at home on the night of the murders, but he had no one to corroborate his story. The investigation took another turn when the lab results from the synthetic fibers found at the crime scene came back. They were a perfect match to a specific brand of industrial-grade rope, a brand that was sold exclusively at a hardware store in a neighboring town. The store owner, a man with a photographic memory for faces, remembered selling a large quantity of that particular rope to a man a few days before the murders. He described the man as being in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and a noticeable scar on his left cheek. He had paid in cash and had seemed to be in a hurry. The description didn't match Jake Miller or Mr. Henderson. A composite sketch was created based on the store owner's description and was circulated throughout the county, but no one seemed to recognize the man with the scar. The media, which had been a constant presence in Havenwood since the discovery of the bodies, seized upon every new development in the case, often sensationalizing the details and creating a narrative that was more fiction than fact. Jake Miller was all but convicted in the court of public opinion, his face plastered across the front pages of a dozen different newspapers. Mr. Henderson was portrayed as a sinister and mysterious figure, a modern-day bogeyman who preyed on innocent young women. The pressure on Brody and his team intensified with each passing day. The town, once united in its grief, was now divided by suspicion and fear. Accusations were hurled, friendships were strained, and the once tight-knit community of Havenwood began to unravel at the seams. The families of Sarah and Emily were living in a private hell. Their grief was a raw and open wound, and the lack of progress in the investigation was a constant source of torment. They held press conferences, their faces etched with pain and desperation, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Their tearful pleas were broadcast across the state, a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of this senseless tragedy. The community rallied around them, organizing fundraisers and candlelight vigils, but nothing could fill the void that had been left in their lives. As the investigation dragged on, a new and even more terrifying possibility began to emerge. A retired detective from a neighboring county, a man who had a reputation for solving cold cases, contacted Sheriff Brody with a chilling theory. He had been following the details of the Silent Creek murders and had noticed some striking similarities to a series of unsolved murders that had occurred in his jurisdiction over a decade ago. In those cases, young women had been abducted, held captive, and then brutally murdered, their bodies disposed of in remote, wooded areas. The killer in those cases had never been caught, and the trail had gone cold years ago. The detective, whose name was Peterson, suggested that the Havenwood killer might be the same person, a serial killer who had been dormant for years and had now resurfaced. The thought that they might be dealing with a serial killer sent a fresh wave of terror through Havenwood. The idea of a faceless, nameless predator who had been preying on young women for years was almost too much to bear. Brody, initially skeptical of Peterson's theory, couldn't ignore the eerie parallels between the cases. The method of abduction, the use of rope, the brutal nature of the assaults, it was all disturbingly similar. He reluctantly agreed to share the details of his investigation with Peterson, hoping that a fresh pair of eyes might see something that he and his team had missed. The investigation now had a new and even more urgent focus. They were no longer just looking for a local killer. They were hunting a monster who had been honing his craft for years. The composite sketch of the man with the scar was recirculated, this time with a warning that he was a suspected serial killer. The FBI was brought in to assist with the investigation, their resources and expertise providing a much-needed boost to the small, overwhelmed police department. A task force was formed, a team of seasoned investigators from multiple agencies, all working towards a common goal: to catch the killer before he could strike again. But the killer, whoever he was, remained elusive. He was a ghost, a phantom who had managed to operate in the shadows for years, leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered families in his wake. He was clever, methodical, and he knew how to cover his tracks. The investigation was a frustrating and painstaking process, a search for a needle in a haystack of 1,000 false leads and dead ends. The widening gyre of fear and suspicion continued to spiral out of control in Havenwood, and the terrifying truth of what had happened to Sarah Jenkins and Emily Peterson remained buried in the darkness, waiting to be brought into the light. The echo of silence from Silent Creek had now become a deafening roar, a roar that would not be silenced until justice was served. The autumn leaves had long since fallen, and a cold, unforgiving winter had descended upon Havenwood. The once picturesque town was now a landscape of grays and browns, a reflection of the somber mood that had gripped its residents. The investigation into the Silent Creek murders had entered its 4th month, and the initial frenzy of activity had settled into a slow, grinding, and often demoralizing routine. The task force, a dedicated team of local and federal investigators, worked tirelessly, sifting through mountains of evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and chasing down every lead, no matter how remote. But the killer, the man with the scar, remained a phantom, a ghost who had seemingly vanished into thin air. The composite sketch had been plastered on every lamppost, in every storefront, and on every news channel in a 5-state radius. Thousands of tips had poured in, each one meticulously followed up, but they all led to dead ends. The man with the scar, it seemed, was a man with no name, no past, and no digital footprint. He was a ghost in the machine of modern society, a man who had somehow managed to live his life off the grid, a man who was all but invisible. The weight of the investigation was taking its toll on everyone involved. Sheriff Brody, once a man of unwavering optimism and a firm believer in the inherent goodness of people, found himself battling a growing sense of cynicism and despair. The faces of Sarah and Emily haunted his dreams, their silent pleas for justice a constant and painful reminder of his failure to find their killer. The town of Havenwood, once a close-knit community, was now a town of strangers, a place where trust had been replaced by suspicion and fear. The breakthrough in the case came from a place no one had expected. It came not from a brilliant piece of detective work or a lucky break in the forensic evidence, but from the quiet, unassuming world of a local librarian. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a woman in her late 50s who had a passion for local history and a mind like a steel trap. She had been following the case with a morbid fascination, her heart aching for the two young women and their families. One evening, while archiving a collection of old town records, she came across a series of photographs from a town festival that had taken place over a decade ago. As she was digitizing the photos, one face in the crowd caught her eye. It was a young man, smiling and laughing with a group of friends. And on his left cheek, there was a faint but unmistakable scar. Eleanor's heart began to race. She compared the photograph to the composite sketch that had been seared into her memory. The resemblance was uncanny. She immediately contacted the sheriff's office, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. The man in the photograph, she explained, was named Thomas Weaver. He had grown up in Havenwood but had left town shortly after the festival, telling everyone that he was moving to the city to find work. No one had heard from him since. The name Thomas Weaver was like a key that unlocked a door that had been sealed shut for years. The task force immediately began to dig into his past, and what they found was a chilling and disturbing portrait of a deeply troubled individual. He had a history of juvenile delinquency, a string of minor offenses that had escalated in severity over time. He had been a loner, a social outcast who had a reputation for being cruel to animals and having a fascination with knives. He had been a suspect in a series of unsolved arsons that had plagued the town years ago, but there had never been enough evidence to charge him. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Weaver's sudden departure from Havenwood coincided with the timeline of the unsolved murders that Detective Peterson had been investigating in the neighboring county. A background check revealed that he had worked a series of odd jobs, many of them in construction and demolition, which would have given him access to the type of industrial-grade rope that had been used to bind the victims. He had no social security number, no credit cards, no digital footprint. He had been living his life as a ghost, a man who had deliberately and methodically erased himself from the world. The hunt for Thomas Weaver began in earnest. The task force, armed with his name and a decade-old photograph, launched a nationwide manhunt. They tracked his movements through a series of cash-only jobs and temporary addresses, a breadcrumb trail of a life lived in the shadows. The trail eventually led them to a remote and isolated cabin in the mountains of a neighboring state, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. The raid on the cabin was swift and silent. A team of heavily armed officers descended on the property in the dead of night, their movements shrouded by the darkness and the falling snow. They found Weaver inside, asleep in his bed. He was older now, his face weathered and his eyes filled with a cold, dead emptiness. But the scar on his left cheek was still there, a permanent and damning reminder of his past. He offered no resistance, no words of protest. It was as if he had been expecting them, as if he knew that his life on the run was finally over. The search of the cabin was a journey into the heart of a killer's depraved mind. In a hidden cellar, they found a collection of trophies, personal belongings of his victims, a gruesome and chilling testament to his reign of terror. There were driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, and locks of hair, each one a memento of a life he had stolen. And in a locked metal box, they found a series of journals, his handwriting a neat and precise script that detailed his crimes in cold and clinical detail. He wrote of his fantasies, his methods, and his complete and utter lack of remorse. He was a predator, a monster who took pleasure in the fear and suffering of his victims. The news of Weaver's arrest sent a wave of relief and disbelief through Havenwood. The man who had terrorized their town for months was not a faceless stranger, but one of their own, a boy who had grown up in their midst, a monster who had been hiding in plain sight. The sense of betrayal was palpable. The people of Havenwood had been living in fear of a phantom, while the real monster had been a familiar face from their past. Thomas Weaver confessed to everything. In a series of videotaped interviews, he calmly and dispassionately recounted the details of his crimes, his voice a monotone drone that betrayed no emotion. He had been killing for over a decade, his victims a string of young women who had had the misfortune of crossing his path. He had chosen Sarah and Emily at random, seeing them at the bonfire and following them when they left. He had disabled their car, offered them a ride, and then driven them to a secluded spot where he had subjected them to hours of torture before finally ending their lives. His confession was a chilling and horrifying glimpse into the mind of a psychopath, a man who was completely devoid of empathy or compassion. The trial was a mere formality. The evidence against Weaver was overwhelming, and his confession left no room for doubt. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death, a sentence that brought a small measure of closure to the families of his victims, but could never erase the pain and suffering he had caused. The town of Havenwood slowly began to heal. The fear that had gripped the community began to recede, replaced by a renewed sense of unity and resilience. The story of the Silent Creek murders became a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil can exist in the most unexpected of places, that the quiet and unassuming facade of a small town can sometimes hide the darkest of secrets. The silence of Silent Creek had been broken by a scream of terror, but it was now a place of quiet reflection, a place where the community came to remember the two young women whose lives had been so tragically cut short. The echo of their laughter, their hopes, and their dreams would forever be a part of the town's history, a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of a community to come together in the face of unspeakable tragedy. The terrifying truth of what had happened had left everyone in a state of cold fear, but it had also brought them closer, their shared grief a bond that would never be broken. The monster had been unmasked, and while the scars he had left on the town would never fully fade, the people of Havenwood had found a way to move forward, to reclaim their town, and to ensure that the names of Sarah Jenkins and Emily Peterson would never be forgotten. A year had passed. The earth had completed its slow, indifferent journey around the sun, bringing autumn back to Havenwood. The leaves once again turned to brilliant shades of crimson and gold, a spectacular, fiery display that in years past had been a source of civic pride. But now, for the residents of the small town, the vibrant colors served only as a painful annual reminder. It was the color of the leaves in the woods surrounding Silent Creek. It was the color of the water on that horrific morning. It was the color of the blood that had been stolen from two of their brightest lights. The trial of Thomas Weaver was a distant memory, a brutal but necessary chapter that had been closed. Justice, in its cold, procedural form, had been served. Weaver was on death row, a caged animal awaiting an inevitable end, his name now a whispered curse in the town where he was raised. The media circus had packed up and moved on to the next tragedy, leaving Havenwood to grapple with the aftermath in quiet solitude. But the absence of cameras and headlines did not mean the story was over. For Havenwood, the story was now etched into its very soul. Sheriff Brody stood by his office window, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and watching the leaves drift down onto the street. He was a year older and he felt it in his bones. The case had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there before, and a permanent weariness had settled deep in his eyes. He had won. They had caught the monster. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a scar, a deep, jagged wound that might heal over but would never truly disappear. The town itself bore similar scars. The naive innocence that had once been Havenwood's defining characteristic was gone, replaced by a cautious, weary vigilance. People locked their doors now, a practice once considered an unnecessary city habit. Parents watched their children with a hawk-like intensity, the fear of a hidden predator now a tangible part of their reality. The case had done more than just take 2 lives. It had stolen a collective sense of security that the community might never fully regain. Even the landscape was altered. Silent Creek was no longer a picturesque spot for a morning walk or a teenage rendezvous. The town council, in a quiet ceremony, had renamed it the Sisters Creek Memorial Path. A simple, elegant granite bench was installed near the spot where George Hemlock had made his grim discovery. Engraved on it were the names Sarah Jenkins and Emily Peterson, along with a quote they had both chosen for their high school yearbook. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. The place was no longer a site of horror, but one of somber pilgrimage. People left flowers, small stones, and handwritten notes, transforming a place of unimaginable darkness into a sanctuary of remembrance. The collateral damage of the investigation also lingered. Jake Miller, the hot-headed young man who had been the initial prime suspect, had left Havenwood. Though officially cleared, he couldn't escape the whispers and the suspicious glances. The court of public opinion had scarred him, and he had sought anonymity in a city far away, another life altered by Weaver's evil. Mr. Henderson, the eccentric recluse, had retreated even further into his isolation, the brief, unwanted spotlight having reinforced his distrust of the outside world. On the anniversary of the discovery, Brody knew he had to see the families. It was a duty he dreaded but would not shirk. He drove first to the Jenkins home. The vibrant, colorful paintings that Sarah had created still adorned the walls, a beautiful but heartbreaking testament to a talent that would never reach its full potential. Mrs. Jenkins met him at the door. Her grief had not lessened, but it had changed. It had hardened into a fierce, determined resolve. She and her husband had started the Sarah's Light Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing art scholarships and self-defense classes for young women in rural communities. They had channeled their pain into purpose, a way to ensure their daughter's light would never be extinguished. "We can't let him take anything else from us, Sheriff," she said, her voice steady. "He took our daughter, but he won't take our hope." His next visit was to the Peterson family. Their home was quieter, the grief a softer, more pervasive presence. Emily's dream of becoming a veterinarian was memorialized in a large garden they had planted in their backyard, filled with plants known to attract birds and butterflies. Mr. Peterson, a man of few words, walked Brody through the garden, pointing out the different species of birds that now called it home. "Emily would have loved this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw the good in every living creature, even the ones others overlooked." Theirs was a more private healing, a quiet tribute to a gentle soul. They hadn't sought the public eye. They had sought solace in nature, the very thing their daughter had cherished. Leaving the Petersons, Brody felt the profound truth of the situation settle over him. There was no single path through grief, no right way to heal from such a wound. The town, like the families, was finding its own way forward, piece by piece. Later that evening, the entire town gathered at the memorial path for a candlelight vigil. The flickering flames cast a warm, gentle glow on the faces in the crowd, faces of friends, neighbors, and strangers, all united by a shared loss. The local pastor said a few words, not of vengeance or anger, but of remembrance and community. They didn't speak of the monster, they spoke of the girls. They shared stories of Sarah's infectious laugh and Emily's boundless kindness. They remembered them not as victims, but as the vibrant, loving young women they had been. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Brody remained by the granite bench, watching the last of the candles burn down. The terrifying truth of the case, he realized, was not just that a monster like Thomas Weaver could exist. It was that he had grown up among them, a product of their own community's quiet neglects and unseen cracks. The evil wasn't an invading force. It was a sickness that had festered in their midst, unnoticed until it was too late. That was the knowledge that left everyone in a permanent state of cold fear, the understanding that darkness can wear a familiar face. Yet, as he stood there in the encroaching twilight, he saw something else. He saw a community that had been shattered but not broken. He saw families who had turned unimaginable pain into purpose. He saw a town that had refused to be defined by its darkest moment. The silence of the creek was different now. It was no longer an echo of terror. It was a silence of peace, of memory, and of a grim, hard-won strength. The scars remained, a permanent part of Havenwood's story, but they were a testament not to the wound itself, but to the fact that it had been survived. Life, in all its fragility and resilience, would go on.